Morning everyone, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, the 61st in the series. We'll get started in a few moments. Morning Maureen. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. As I say, it's the 61st in the series, looking this week at Drovers and Hamilton's auction Mart. If you're new to the series, then my name's Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands. We have the Highland Archive and Registration Centre in Inverness, Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Lochalsh Archive Centre in Portree. And this series we started well over a year ago now to look at just a way of bringing some of the collections that we look after to people who maybe couldn't get in because of the lockdown, or maybe couldn't get in because of geographical distance or any other reason. So if you are new, do say hello. We've formed a friendly bunch of people who all say hello to each other. So if you're new, come and say hello. Before I go into this week's subject, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this. But if you are able to donate, if you're in a position to be able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. And there's, whether you're watching live now on Facebook or whether you're watching subsequently on YouTube, there's a link within the body of the text to be able to donate, and we are truly grateful for those of you who have been able to do that. The other thing I'm very grateful for those of you who have filled out the survey, if you haven't yet done so, again, there's a link within the body of the text to do so. That will be closing on the 31st of this month, so if you haven't yet filled out the survey, please do that. And thank you also to those of you who have been sharing the events. I mentioned last week that there seems to have been a slight change in the way the films are going out, so thank you to those of you who have shared and promoted them. It's really, really appreciated. Okay, so this week is the final in our business and industry theme for the month. Deliberately, I've positioned it at the end of the month because next month we're going into landscape and environment as a subject. And Drovers and the auction marts particularly straddle those themes of landscape, environment and business. Actually, as do the diatomite industry, the aluminium industry, all of those big industries that we've had across the Highlands have really had a noticeable impact on the landscape and the environment that we live in still. But yeah, I thought this one particularly tied across the two themes. So I'm going to start with a Highland-wide kind of look at drovers, the subject of the drove roads and drovers, and then go on to look specifically at one mart and how that came into being. I'd like to particularly thank my colleague Anne at Nucleus this week. This is a subject that I know a lot of people feel quite attached to and engaged with, and Anne is one of those people, so I want particularly to thank her for all the notes that she has sent over to me. It's really been very useful for me putting this together. Drovers, for those of you who are not familiar with the word, are the people who historically walked livestock from farms or sellers or producers of any kind to the markets for sale. This was right across the UK and of course across other countries too. And again, Jenny in Australia, maybe some of the people who will subsequently watch in the US or Canada might have something to add into the comments about the droving traditions in their own countries. So please do that. I know it's a lot of interest to people looking back as well. So for centuries, of course, the Highlands had no real transport infrastructure other than horse tracks and tracks that would be walked. And so if cattle and sheep that were bred in the north of Scotland needed to be sold, they then needed to be moved to the marts in either the south or the central belt of Scotland, south of Scotland, or in England. And for many years, the place that most of that trading took place was Crieff, which some of you I'm sure will know is a beautiful town in Perthshire, and then later Falkirk. To give you an idea of the scale of these numbers of beasts being sold, in the mid-1700s there were about 30,000 cattle being sold each year at Crieff. By the late 1700s, it was around 60,000 in Falkirk. So substantial numbers of animals that needed to be moved across the country. That journey, of course, had to be made on the hoof, as it was called, so on foot. And of course, that was a long, hard, and often very difficult process. Now, farmers and crofters who were breeding and producing the livestock couldn't leave their farms, their crofts, their houses to travel themselves to the markets, and so they would employ drovers who undertook the driving of the animals across the country. This would usually start round about early May, so not too far off where we are now, and the drovers would start visiting round, approaching the crofters and the farmers, bartering to be the ones who had the job of taking that farmer's animals to the market on their journey. So it was a case of going from place to place, drumming up business effectively. So they would go from settlement to settlement until they eventually would gather a large enough herd to set off on the journey, and that would quite often be hundreds of animals. After the Union of the Parliaments in 1707, the demand for Scottish beef in particular grew so high that the numbers increased and increased. And so various sources that I've looked at said that eventually the drovers essentially became Highland cowboys. Now, as I mentioned, these journeys were long and difficult, and yes, Fiona, I'm seeing your comment there, dangerous journeys as well, absolutely. And they had to pick their routes very carefully. So the routes had to be reasonably easy walking for the animals because they're going on such a long journey. They don't want the animals to become injured because, of course, that's where the money is. They still want them to get a good price at the other end as well. So it had to be reasonably easy walking. The routes also had to allow for water and shelter so that the livestock could be fed and watered on the way. And they would often go by the halfpenny fields, which were fields that the owner had agreed that they would take halfpenny for grazing rights. I think probably water would be the most important thing, and so you can see the way the drove roads followed the routes of watercourses and rivers and so on. If any of you are not familiar with the drove roads, then if you go onto our website, Ambala, again, I'll spell it because I always need to spell it, www.ambaile.org. If you have a look on our website there, you'll see you can search drove roads, and there's a map of many of the main drove roads across the Highlands, across Scotland, shown on there. So yes, so often they would follow the route of places of grazing and water. As I said, the going could be very hard, and one of the collections we hold at the Highland Archives Centre is collection D1237, which is the records of the Highland Livestock Heritage Society. Now, the Highland Livestock Heritage Society was set up and established to commemorate and celebrate the achievements and the lives of livestock breeders and drovers across the Highlands and Islands. It's a wide-ranging collection. It dates from the 1770s through to the 2000s, and it includes all sorts of things. It includes letters, newsletters, maps, society publications, photographs, memories, exhibition material. I'm seeing you saying there, Fiona, about exhibition material, and items also relating to specific marts. And in that collection, is this story, which I wanted to read to you, just a very brief paragraph, which illustrates how difficult the stories, how difficult those journeys could be and how hard the conditions could be. So this is a memory written down by somebody who had heard a tale told to him. So he says, about 65 years ago, I met a 95-year-old drover at a farm sale in Glenlivet. I never knew his name. He was just known by the name of his farm, as is customary. Old Netherton, I think it was. He told me that he had been in a drove from Glenlivet to Falkirk when he was only about 15. They slept in the open, and he had woken one morning with his shoulder and his right arm frozen to the ground. 80 years later, his arm was still semi-paralysed because of this event. Others present confirmed his story, and I certainly believed him. And the person who's recorded this, a gentleman called Peter Barry, then puts a PS on the bottom. PS, a little bit of arithmetic takes us back to the 1860s for this story. So you get an idea there of how difficult the conditions would be. And of course, although they would look after themselves, their main charge is to look after the livestock that they're transporting. The drovers often took working dogs with them. The dogs were tax exempt. And so we hold within that Highland Livestock and Heritage Society collection some true stories about the drovers' dogs and the experiences of the drovers' dogs. Now, these were true stories that were researched and compiled by pupils at Kilhuman Primary School in Fort Augustus. And I wanted to include them because, again, I know my colleague Anne was particularly taken with these stories. So this is an imagined reworking of a true story. So the drovers' dogs would often accompany the drovers down to herd the flocks. And then the drovers' dogs might come back alone, ready to collect the next lot. So this is primary school pupils who have taken the facts behind that and then created a story around it. And this is what they came up with. My name is Fly. I work with my friend Lassie. My master is a drover and we help him. I go from Ullapool to Smithfield in London. We walk 12 miles a day so the cows don't lose weight. When we get to Smithfield, our master waits longer, so we go home by ourselves with a note in our collars saying to feed us. June the 14th, 1873, Bedfordshire. Lassie and I haven't got far yet, and my feet are getting sore. We're really tired after taking our herd down. We're at a little farm in Grimsby near the harbour. We got leftover leek and potato soup. I don't really like it, but Lassie says I need to eat it for my energy. Just before we got to Grimsby, I fell in a bog, but Lassie pulled me out and the farmer's wife will give me a wash before we go on the road again. 15th of June 1873, Edinburgh. We have just passed Edinburgh and we went to the wrong farm, but they still let us in and they had children who played with us. Lassie wasn't as energetic as usual. I'm getting a bit worried now. We met some more drovers too and helped their dogs herd their cows up. They were scattered everywhere. It goes on to talk about the dogs getting lost on their route back, so they go to Oban by mistake, and then there's an update in Fort Augustus, there's an update in Ullapool. And so, as I say, it's very much an imagined creative story put together by school pupils, but it's based in reality, and it's also a great example of how you can engage people. So what child doesn't love a story with a dog in it? So you've taken the facts behind it and then use it to create something fun. Now, the drovers' work, of course, took them across the country, and they also, therefore, played a really vital role in both the economy and the social culture at the time. So they were transporting money. So I saw Fiona saying earlier that it could be a very dangerous job. They were accompanying these animals and livestock down. They were also carrying on their return journey the money that had been made at the markets to transport them back, transport the money back to the farmers. They were also key links in the chain of bringing money and news. So the drovers who would leave the Highlands, travel right through the Central Belt, maybe down into England, and then back up through the country, were often a real conduit of news travelling around the country as well. And so they're key to the economy, to the social life, to the story of inns. You may remember we looked at inns and pubs a wee while ago, because inns would spring up on the routes that the drovers had to travel. So they're really a very key part, a key demographic, key group of people in the way the Highlands was structured and operated. One of the most important reference books on this subject, and if any of you are interested in this subject at all, you'll know what I'm about to say, is A.R.B. Haldane's book, The Drove Roads of Scotland. And in that book, he concluded that the drovers needed to possess these 5 particular qualities. 1, extensive knowledge of the country. 2, endurance and ability to face great hardship. 3, knowledge of cattle. 4, resource, enterprise and good judgment. 5, honesty and reliability for the work entrusted to them. So that's quite a a real skill set range from the practical in terms of the knowledge of the cattle, being able to survive out in the cold and that sort of thing, but also that emphasis on judgment, reliability, honesty, because as I say, they are transporting not only the precious cargo of the livestock, but then also the money back up as well. Coming into the 1800s, several changes meant that the role of the drovers began to change and began to gradually diminish. So there were agricultural changes. For instance, there was a move away from the open grazing system into enclosed field systems. That in turn meant that the type of cattle being bred were different, had different qualities. They were often being larger built and harder to transport and less able to travel those long distances on the hoof. One of the other main changes at this point was the developments in transport. So things like faster steamships, and laterally, of course, as something we always come back and touch on, the development and increase of the railways, meant that need for reliable people to walk the animals from place to place became less and less needed, and gradually those droving days, as they had been, were all but over. And instead, what we started to see was the development of local sale rings and mart days, and this was even in the smallest of places. So the second half will come on and look at the development of one particular mart, Hamilton's Auction Mart, after a reminder that for the first time probably I've managed to get about bang on halfway through, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part. But again, if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very, very grateful for that. Okay, so that takes us up to the 1800s. Now, Hamilton's Auction Mart was formed in 1893 to take over 3 of the kind of small auctioning businesses that were operating at the time. So Messrs Hamilton, Sim and Chivas. And the aim of that was to bring together those 3 roles that we've kind of talked about a little bit, that the drovers played one of those roles. So it's to bring together the auctioneer, the drover and the cashier in one business. Initially, Hamilton's sales took place in Inverness by the river, but the town was growing and changing, as we've seen through other talks in this series. Those years of the late 1800s, really full of change, full of development. And so the town was growing, and the site wasn't ideal. There was a risk of damage to property with all the livestock in the centre of the town, and there was the danger of animals escaping and causing damage. And so the mart moved to near Stephen's Brae, which was near the then site of the Inverness Royal Academy. And then in 1905, the business was formally constituted. It was constituted under the name Hamilton's Auction Mart Company Limited, and William MacDonald was installed as the chairman. And it's interesting to note that although the way of doing business really dramatically changed over that period, the market was still there, that the need for the product, for the market was still there. And so the company expanded. Over the next couple of years, Hamilton's acquired Nairn Auction Mart, and then Messrs Callum Bros in Dingwall. And then in 1919 they took over Forres Auctioneering. So we're branching slightly to the east into Murray and out of Highland for that. And then in 1921 they leased out land in Portree to carry out standalone one-day sales. So you see the spread of the business and that really big geographical area that they were covering. So it was in 1922 that Hamilton's commenced business in Thurso, which is, I would imagine, if any of you are familiar with Hamilton's Auction Mart, it may well be the Thurso one that you're thinking of. The mart was situated next to the station, as many marts were. And incidentally, again, that link between all the subjects and all the collections that we've talked about so many times. The building that they used for Hamilton's Auction Mart in Thurso, next to the train station, had formerly been used as the changing rooms and the eating and rest areas for the servicemen who were en route to Scapa Flow during World War One. So again, that story of no part of our history stands in isolation. There's always connections between the buildings, between the places, between the people. At Nucleus, where the bulk of the Hamiltons collection is held, there are some Hamiltons items within the Highland Livestock Heritage Society collection I mentioned before, but the bulk of the Hamiltons collection is held at Nucleus. And within that collection, there are plans from the Mart from both 1923, so not long after it had opened there, and also after an expansion in 1949. By 1925, the Wick branch of Hamilton's had started operating livestock auctions, and again we start to see that that huge increase in dramatic speeding up of the business. So I mentioned in the early days the taking over of Nairn, of Dingwall, of Forres, those day sales in Portree. By the 1920s, we've got Thurso in development, we've got Wick, but then by 1927, Invergordon Mart had been purchased. 1929, land in Dingwall had been purchased for cattle grazing. And this progress carried on throughout the 20th century. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar, please do tell me if you are familiar with the Caithness at War section on the Nucleus website. So we have the Highland Archive Service website, which has information about all the offices on it, but then within that there are individual pages for each office. Now the Nucleus and Nuclear and Caithness Archive website contains a section called Caithness at War, and what that does is it goes right throughout the years of the Second World War, every week looking at archive collections relating to what was happening during that week. So if you're not familiar with that, please do go and have a look at it. But within the section for this week of the 16th to the 22nd of August 1943, our website there with the Caithness at War records the lamb sales that were taking place. So it records that there were lamb sales taking place, and I'm going to read them so that I don't miss anybody out, at Dunbeath, Brora, Hallidale, Loth and various other locations. And within that week, in Thurso's Hamiltons alone, they sold a record 34,000 lambs over 4 days. And the entry at the time says, a very brisk trade throughout at the highest prices ever recorded for them at the centre. At Nucleus we hold the sales book for this sale, detailing the buyers, detailing where they lived and who they were. And it's just really interesting, and again I know I will have spoken about this a lot over the weeks and the year, but it's interesting how much you can, looking in those records, you can see the comparison between what's going on internationally, the war that, you know, hundreds of Caithness men will have been involved in, but also what's happening on the home front as well. It's really interesting. So 34,000 lambs over those 4 days in August in 1943, which was a record for the time. It's admittedly not quite as high as one of the Lairg Marts in 1994, which sold 40,000 lambs in a short space of time. Now the figures for the Hamiltons 1969 sale just pulled as an example to show the scale of the industry. So it records in 1969 600 cattle sold at Thurso and Leibster, 55,000 cattle at Thurso and Forsnard, 7,000 half-bred lambs at Thurso, 600 weaned calves and store cattle at Thurso. So a really substantial industry, and that just goes on and on. By the 1980s, the Scottish auctions as a whole were handling around about an estimated 5 million sheep, 900,000 cattle and 113,000 pigs at a value of around about £607 million. So it's a substantial business within Highland history, within Scottish history, and as I say, I'm sure many of you watching in England and in other countries will be familiar with this industry as well. Did anyone who's watching grow up in and around a market town? If you do, please type that into the comments and just let us know. There's a very distinct feeling around Mart Day. the towns would be bustling and full. So there would be all the local people involved, but also incoming farmers and families, stockmen, people coming from, certainly to the Caithness marts, people coming from England up to take part in those markets. So people discussing sales, prices, farming procedures, breeding tactics, all sorts of different things. And you can imagine the sound, and as I say, many of you I'm sure will remember the sound of all the vehicles going by, the cattle floats, the sound of the animals, cattle, sheep, the auctioneers with that very fast way of speaking. And of course, the knock-on effect of that on the local industry. So the impact that that would have on shops, on cafes, on pubs, hotels, of all those people coming. So you begin to see how very important Mart Day was as a social, as part of the social structure and as part of the local economy. Hugely important for a county like Caithness. Now, in the mid 1990s, the industry was beginning to change. Market conditions were difficult, so there was a decrease in breeding stock, and there was an increase in rates for the sale rings. All of this resulted in United Auctions Limited, who were a Perth-based company, needing to step in, and they pooled resources with Hamilton's auction mart to work together. It's quite nice in a way that link to United Auctions, as I mentioned, they were a Perth-based auction company. So that link that had started so many years ago with the drovers travelling backwards and forwards to Perth, to Crieff, that link was maintained, although it was in difficult circumstances. So by 1996, Hamilton's and the UA partnership was operating markets in Thurso, in Leibster, in Forcenard. Again, that link between the two. But in 2006, 2007, Hamilton's auction in Thurso, the mart, was closed. Very much an end of an era for the town, and if anyone is watching in Thurso or Wick or surrounding areas, then I'm sure you'll agree with that. An end of an era for the town and for those people who lived in the area or worked in that industry. One of the things that we're always very, very concerned about as an archive service is whenever a business closes, and I will have mentioned this in different guises over the weeks, when a business closes, when a person passes away, when there's a reorganisation, like a local government reorganisation, anything like that, there's always a risk of heritage being lost, of records being lost, whenever there's a point of change, because you never know if the people coming in will throw things out. Maybe there won't be any people coming in. So there's always a moment of risk there. And so in 2019, an appeal was put out asking anyone who had had a connection with Hamilton's auction mart to get in touch with Ian Thompson, who had been the managing director of Hamilton's and the UA partnership from 1996 until he retired in 2001, or with Peter Mackay, who was the former auctioneer. The request being, if you had anything at all connected to the mart, to consider donating it to the collection to make sure that it wasn't lost. And it was amazing. It resulted in donations coming in from far and wide. So ledgers, route rolls, catalogues, photos, memories, all sorts of different things came in. Those were then all displayed in a charity exhibition at Force. There were around about 300 visitors who attended, because as I say, it's an industry that is close to people's heart, especially if they've lived in and around it. And it raised over £1,000 for charity. And then the items that had been deposited were gathered in and deposited at Caithness Nuclear and Caithness Archive. So that's how we came to have a large collection of Hamilton's records. They are now safe for future generations to use, both to remember with, to learn from. You can use them to learn about sales trends, about breed popularity, about the social history and development of Caithness, all sorts of subject. And it's an example of how we get our collections. It's a thing people ask me all the time: how do you get these collections? And there's a variety of routes, and I can certainly go on and talk on about that for some time. But that's an example of one. And if you are part of a group or a club or a business or an industry or anything which has been part of the story of the Highlands, and there are records that are at risk of being lost, please do contact us, because as I hope we've conveyed over the last year, it really is our passion to make sure that those records and those stories are kept safe. And that was a great privilege for us to be able to be part of that with Hamilton's, and to keep those records in existence for future generations. I hope that's been of interest, finishing on time today. But yes, so an interesting industry, and one with a long history, and how that's had to change and develop according to technology, according to changing market conditions, and all sorts of different things that come to press on that. So thank you for joining me this week. I hope that you can join me next week. Next week I'll be looking at the records of Inverness Field Club, an organisation still going strong today, established about 150 years ago, for the pursuit of science and knowledge of things like geography, natural history, geology, things like that. So I hope you can join me next week to look at the Inverness Field Club records. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of talks. But if you are able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. And if you're able to complete our survey, then I would be grateful for that as well. So thank you so much, and I will see you all next week.